All right, guys, starting chapter 7, ownership of real estate. This chapter, we're going to talk about types of ownership when you have more than one owner involved. So we're going to describe different forms of ownership, explain the differences between condos, co-ops, and learn about timeshares. First, let's start off. What do you call it when there's only one owner involved? We call that tenancy in severalty. Severalty does not mean more than one owner. It means one owner. It does not come from the root word several, like it may sound. It comes from the root word sever. You see, sever. Your interests are severed from all others. That is sole ownership or tenancy in severalty. That's ownership by one person or entity. All right. So what is an entity? Well, it's an artificial person like business, for tax purposes, they're referred to as an entity. A business can own a property. So the owner is free to devise the property to anyone they like in a will, the last will and testament. So you have this highlighted on the first page, 119. Sole ownership or tenancy in severalty. The term severalty means your interests are severed from all others. When that person dies, title to the property passes to their heirs or devisees. And then on page 120, here's that chart I told you about. I want you guys to write above where it says person giving the product. I want you to write OR in quotes like that. And above where it says person receiving the product, I want you to write EE. So these are words that end in OR. Here are the words that end in EE. The words that end in OR is the person that's giving whatever the product or the root word is, devise in this case. And the one that's receiving it, the words that end in EE. So devise is to leave property to someone in a will upon death. So the devisor is the one who leaves that property, and the devisee is the one who's receiving it. We grant ownership from one party to the next when we give it to them or sell it to them. And the grantor is the one that gives that property, and the grantee is the one receiving it. A legacy is the personal property we've amassed during our lifetime, and a legator is the one who gives that property to someone who is called the legatee. Lease, you don't need to study this one. I don't think that one's on exam. Lease and lessor, lessee, you need to understand who those players are. We all know what a lease is. That's the contract where one property owner grants their possession of their property and all their rights to that property, with the exception of the right to sell it or mortgage it, to a tenant for a limited period of time, as defined in the lease. The lessor is the one who gives them the lease. That's the landlord. The lessee is the one who receives the lease. That's the tenant. See, doesn't that make it a lot easier to figure out who the players are with the words OR and EE? Who's the lessor? Who's the lessee? Well, lessor is the one that gives the lease. Lessee is the one that receives the lease. Doesn't that make it easier to figure it out? Or is it just me?
It does.
All right. Now, the word mortgage, we skipped over this one before because the word mortgage, you got a little asterisk next to that one too, because the word mortgage, it probably means the opposite of what you think it means. When I ask people usually what a mortgage is, their answer to me is usually it's a loan. No, it's not. There is such a thing called a mortgage loan, but that's two words, mortgage loan. The word mortgage itself is a promise to pay. If you get a mortgage loan, that means you're getting a loan in return for giving a mortgage to the lender. A mortgage is your promise to pay them back. See, if you give them that promise in writing to pay them back, they'll give you a loan. So that's what the mortgage is. The mortgage is the promise to pay. So the mortgagor is the one who's giving their promise, not the one who's giving the money. So the mortgagor is the borrower, not the other way around. And the mortgagee is the lender. Another way to remember this is the word mortgagor has two O's in it. The word mortgagee has two E's in it. So does the word lender. Word mortgagor has two O's. So does borrower. The word mortgagee has two E's in it, and so does the word lender. Okay. So the mortgagor is the borrower. You either have to remember the whole story, that a mortgage is a promise to pay. Banks don't give promises, they give loans. And you're giving your promise to the bank. That's why you're the mortgagor. The borrower is the mortgagor. But if you don't want to remember that whole story, it's easy to remember just by remembering what the little rhyme or what have you. Just sing it out. The mortgagor is the borrower. Who's the mortgagor?
Lender.
The borrower. The mortgagor is the borrower. My annoying voice is going to be stuck in your head, hopefully. That the mortgagor, who's the mortgagor?
The borrower.
Borrower.
The borrower. The mortgagor is the borrower. See, this way you don't have to think and remember the whole process and how that works and how it breaks down. You just remember the little rhyme there. The mortgagor is the borrower. You sing it out if you need to. Okay. And then you shouldn't forget. And then you don't even really need to think about it. I like things like that. I like simple, stupid stuff that you don't even, it doesn't even make me think. I could figure it out, just the mortgagor is the borrower, and then I'll remember it that way. Because look, you're probably not going to get a question on the exam, who is the mortgagor? I mean, you may, but I doubt it. They'll probably give you a question. They'll probably give you some long-winded question on the exam that uses the word mortgagor, mortgagee, and all that stuff. And your brain is going to be all twisted trying to figure out, wait, what the hell did they just ask of me? Because they're using all these phrases and terms in a question. See, if you just could remember if you remember the definitions of these words, who the players are, you could figure it out real quick. And now you could answer the question and understand what they're asking of you. So if the question says in there, has the word mortgagor right off the bat, I'm like, the mortgagor is the borrower. Okay, so that's the mortgagor is the borrower. Okay, so they're asking about the borrower, and then let's continue reading the rest of the question. Remember how I tell you guys how to better understand these questions is to try to define the words as you're reading them and reword the question in an easier to understand way. Instead of using all the new terms, if you read the question out with all the new terms that you learned, it's going to be like, wait, what the F did I just read? And you're going to read it 10 times and you're going to be like, confused, my brain hurts. You're better off just trying to stop when you see one of these words, these new terms. Okay, who's that? Ask yourself a question about the question. Okay, now let's reword that question and read up to that point again with the, okay, instead of using the word mortgagor, I'm going to say, okay, the borrower. And then let's continue reading the question, see what it says. And if they use any other words like that, you're going to define them, redefine them, and then read the question again. Okay, so that you understand it fully. If you fully understand the question, it's perfectly clear, it makes it a lot easier to go from there. Okay, we don't need to go through the rest of this list, but basically you guys get it. This is the guide that shows you the words that end in OR is the person who's giving whatever the root word is. The only one that's difficult to understand is probably the one mortgage. And for most people, it's probably the opposite person that you think it is. Because most people think the mortgagor is the bank, the lender who's lending them the money. When in fact, the mortgage is not a loan. It's actually a promise to pay. So it's the borrower who's given the money. But instead of having to remember all that, you could either just remember it's the opposite of what you think it is, or the mortgagor is the
Borrower.
borrower. There you go.
If it's on the test, I'm definitely gonna remember your voice saying that.
Yeah. My annoying voice will be stuck in your head, but that's good. That's a good thing in this.
That's the point.
That's the point. That's right. Okay, and so I give all my explanations. Here's another chart of the same thing. I just give that explanation here. All right. So look, even lenders misuse these terms on commercials. You guys probably all seen this commercial before, and the lenders misusing the terms because they're not trying to educate you or tell you that you're using the word mortgage wrong and what it really means, and then giving you a whole real estate lesson on it. But I have to do that because this is a real estate class, and in order to get the questions right on exam, you need to understand it. Right? You all seen this commercial?
Looking sharp, Len. Who's the lucky lady?
I'm going to the bank to discuss a mortgage.
See, you get a loan, you put on a suit, you get calling to the bank. This is how I dress to get a mortgage.
Well, they missaid it right there. You don't get a mortgage. If you're trying to get a loan, you're giving a mortgage. In return, banks don't give mortgages, they give loans. Banks don't, because a mortgage is a promise. Banks don't make promises, they make loans. Okay, so he misused the term right there. But let's watch it. This is a silly commercial.
I just go to Lending Tree. I calculate how much home I can afford. I get multiple offers to compare side by side. And the best part is, the banks come crawling to me.
Everything you need to get a better mortgage. Clothing optional. Lending Tree. When banks compete, you win.
Okay. Awkward.
That is a cute commercial. All right.
Look,
But you could see there, they were misusing the word mortgage, because what is a mortgage? It's a promise to pay. Banks don't make promises, they make loans. All right, so here are the forms of ownership that we're going to go over. Tenancy and severalty, that's ownership by one person or entity. Your interests are severed from all others, so that's ownership by one person. We're going to go over tenancy by the entirety. That's a type of ownership between married couples. We're going to go over the default form of ownership when you have two or more owners that are not married to each other. This is called tenancy in common. And then we're going to go over the more complicated joint tenancy that you have to specify you wish to take ownership in this form instead of the normal tenancy in common. But in order to create a joint tenancy, there has to be certain things in place. We're going to go over what's required to create a joint tenancy. Those four unities that you have to have in common to create the joint tenancy, how joint tenancy can be terminated, and what the only benefit to having a joint tenancy is. So, yeah, you need to understand this all for exams too. These are more concept things than terms and definitions. So that makes these a little bit more complicated because it's a concept rather than just a term and a definition. So I'm going to teach you the ins and outs of all of this. And remember, you guys can watch these videos if you need the explanation again. But keep in mind, I'm going to teach you the ins and outs so that you're going to understand what the difference is between a tenancy and severalty by the entirety, tenancy in common, and joint tenancy. And you're going to be able to understand and answer questions that are asked to you. But they can be tricky sometimes too. And there's one that I consider it kind of a trick question. If they, depending on how the question is posed to you, if the question spells out a scenario for you and then asks you, how would you advise that the people take ownership in this scenario? Stop right there. Advising people on the different forms of ownership and how to take ownership, that's legal advice. We're not attorneys. We don't give legal advice. So that's a trick question. So even though there may be one answer there that is the answer you should probably select, that's probably a good answer. If they give you the answer option, none of the above, select that one, because the answer is none of the above because we don't give legal advice, and this is legal advice on what form of ownership to take. And you're like, damn, but I know which one would be the best one that they should take in this scenario. Yeah, we're teaching you that, but we're also teaching you that that's legal advice, and we don't give legal advice. Only attorneys can do that. We got to teach you about the different forms of ownership and when it makes sense and all that stuff so that you have an understanding of it from a real estate standpoint of what the attorneys are doing and what forms of ownership are, what the differences are. That's it. But we don't give advice to somebody on which form of ownership to take because that would be legal advice and we never give legal advice because we're not licensed attorneys. So we're not going to practice law without a license, right?
Yep.
Let's highlight tenancy in common. There is no like one-liner sentence to understand tenancy in common, but you could write here, highlight tenancy in common and write default form of ownership. And then continue highlighting when two or more people own property, they do so as tenants in common. Now, it's usually two or more people who are not married to each other creates a tenancy in common. But it could be two or more, that's at least for any other properties. For the primary marital residence, it would not be tenancy in common. That would be a tenancy by the entirety if they're married. But if they're married and this is like a separate investment property they own, they could own them as tenants in common. But generally speaking, we're not talking about married couples when we're talking about two or more people or entities that own a property together. They do so as tenants in common. Or in the commercial real estate world, they love abbreviations for everything. They call it a TIC. Short for tenant in common.
Is the last part in the book or is that from the last book?
No, this is just from page 121, the next page it carries on to.
Oh, okay, now I see it. Thank
So
you.
the top of the next page, you would, so whenever you see something like that and you can't locate it, just look. I probably got the page number over here. It's probably split between two pages.
I looked at 121, but I looked at joint tenancy and below. I didn't even look at that top part.
Yeah, all the way at the top.
It's at the bottom.
Sorry.
It's at the top of it.
All right.
Wait 1 second.
Yeah, wait a second.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Keep doing your writing. I'm just going to keep talking. So you got tenancy in common. That's the default form of ownership when you have two or more owners, usually not married to each other. They own the property together as tenants in common. If a tenant in common wants to dissolve that co-ownership, but the other doesn't, so if one wants to sell and the other one doesn't want to sell, they could buy them out, or you could find your own buyer, but it may be tough to find a buyer to buy out your partial ownership interest in this property with a stranger, and we got that partition proceeding. Remember, we spoke about that before, which is a form of involuntary alienation. That's that court proceeding where a judge will see if they could physically divide the property and put it in separate deeds. If that's not possible, then a judge will order the property sold, and then each owner will get their proportionate ownership shares given to them. Now, the rest in here also further explains the tenancy in common, but you really got to study the whole thing to understand it. It's not like a one-liner. Just know it's the default form of ownership, two or more people not married to each other. Each owner can have unequal shares of ownership. I could be 75% owner and you could be 25% owner because I put down 75% of the cash and you put down only 25% of the cash. With a tenancy in common, you can have unequal ownership shares of interest in that regard. But if I don't specify on the deed that's the form of ownership, that I'm going to be 75% owner and you're going to be 25%, even though I put down 75% of the cash and you put down 25%. If I don't specify that to be put on the deed, we're 50-50. So it's very important that I put that down, right? Let's see. Everybody got all those highlights and everything? We go over this a little bit further on the next slide.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
So I wrote up this slide all about tenancy in common and the partition proceeding as well. That partition proceeding, partition is a court proceeding where one co-owner sues another forcing them to divide the property if physically possible or sell it. This is a form of involuntary alienation because somebody will be forced.
To do so.
Now,
What's the spell?
tenancy in common is the default form of ownership. Two or more owners, or people or entities not married to each other automatically creates a tenancy in common in the deed, unless otherwise specified in the deed that the ownership is to be taken in another form. A corporation can own a property with another corporation. They could have a partial ownership interest. A corporation can own a partial ownership with another corporation or with an individual person. Owners can have unequal ownership shares, like that 25-75 ownership split, like I said. But if you don't specify it in the deed, then it's 50-50. So it's very important to make that a stickling point to make sure that's added to the deed. Otherwise, even if you put up most of the cash, you're going to be 50-50 owners if you don't specify it's to be added in the deed that way. Even though we're not the ones doing this. This is all attorneys handling this stuff. We just need to understand. I'm just explaining how this works. So owners can devise their interests. What does devise mean? It means to leave it in a will to anyone. They could sell their interest without the consent of the other co-owners. They don't need to get the permission from the other co-owners in order to sell their ownership shares. But it may be very difficult to sell their ownership shares and not the whole property. And we as real estate agents, be careful. If you ever get somebody that comes to you and says, yeah, I want to sell my property. But then they go on explaining how there's other co-owners in the property, but they're only looking to sell their interest in the property. Careful. This can be classified as a security. And to sell securities, you need to have a special licensing to deal in securities. That security would also need to be registered with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the state of New Jersey. And you need special licensing to deal in securities. So it's very complicated and difficult to figure out when it would be classified as a security and when it would not be. I read an article on this one time, and I had to read it like 5 times, and I was still kind of confused about it, you know. So to understand when it's considered to be a security, just make sure you get somebody involved that deals in securities, okay? Usually when you're only selling somebody's partial ownership interest in the property and you're not selling the whole property, in most instances, it probably is considered a security. And you need somebody, you could still sell it, but you need to have somebody that also has that special licensing to deal in securities. Now, what kind of securities license do you need to deal in this type of security that's real estate? I'm not sure if it's a Series 3, 5, 7, 63. I'm not sure which series license is required for that. Couldn't tell you. But special, just know that special licensing is required. So owners have an undivided interest in the entire property. What does that mean? It means you cannot physically distinguish which part of the property is mine and which is yours. So if we're 50-50 owners, both you and I own a property together. We have an undivided interest in the property. Yeah, I'm 50% owner of the entire property, and you're 50% owner of the entire property. You cannot physically distinguish. It's not like the Brady Bunch where they put a clothesline or draw a line down the center of the room, and it's like, okay, this is my side of the room, and that's your side of the room. I know that may seem like an obscure reference to some of you who are younger and don't know what the Brady Bunch is, but I got to come up with some newer terms, newer references here. But you guys get the gist of it, right? You can't just draw a line down the center of the room and that's my side of the property and that's your side of the property. It doesn't work like that. If I'm 50% owner of the property, my interest is undivided. I have 50% ownership in every single part of this property. Unless you buy out your partner's interest, you're never going to own it in severalty. That means sole ownership. And tenants in severalty can leave their properties in a will, but tenants in common can as well. When one co-owner wants to sell and the others don't, you could ask them to buy you out, or you could sell your interest on your own, which may be very difficult to do, or you can partition the property. Take your co-owner to court and see if the property can be physically partitioned or force them to sell it so that you could cash out. Any questions?
No.
Nope.
No.
It's all pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of studying it all, right?
Yeah.
Then we have joint tenancy, which is an alternative to tenancy in common. The default form of ownership when you have two or more people not married to each other is a tenancy in common, unless you specify you wish to take ownership in another form. And what form of ownership would you specify? Joint tenancy. So joint tenancy is when two or more people, not entities, a corporation can never own as a joint tenant. That's why I wrote not entities / corporations. A corporation can never be a joint tenant. I'll explain why in a few moments. But two or more people can also choose to own property as joint tenants. The main feature of joint tenancy is that it carries with it the right of survivorship. So what's the only benefit of creating a joint tenancy? The right of survivorship. It's the only benefit. So what does that mean? That means if one of your co-owners dies, the surviving co-owner or owners will automatically equally split the shares of the owner who died. Doesn't have to go through probate or anything like that. Your co-owners automatically equally split the shares of the owner that died. But wait a minute. If you're a tenancy in common and one of the owners dies, what happens to their shares? They
It
can
goes
leave
to
it in
you.
will to their heirs.
Oh, okay.
But in a joint tenancy, the whole purpose of a joint tenancy is to have the right of survivorship. That means if you die, your surviving co-owners will automatically equally split your shares. So you can't leave it in a will. That's a little stickling point right there, in a way that if they give you some kind of a scenario, you could tell that this is a joint tenancy. If they say there's several owners on a property, but you can't leave it by will in an heir to your heirs, because your co-owners will automatically equally split the shares of the owner who died. You know that that's going to be a joint tenancy. So what's the only benefit to joint tenancy? What's the only benefit to joint tenancy?
They
Owning
can
the right
keep-
of survivorship.
It's the right of survivorship. And
Sorry,
what is the right of survivorship? Whoever's left surviving gets to split the shares of the owner who died. That's what the right of survivorship is. And if anybody gets the idea to ask me, well, what if they all die in a plane accident together or in a bus accident or something, and they all die together? Who gets the ownership? You got to see who died first, and how would you tell and all that. I got these questions all the time, stuff like that. Yeah, if all the co-owners died at once, it would revert back to tenancy in common, and then your heirs would, everybody's heirs would inherit their shares.
So it repeats the process again.
No, they inherit the shares as tenants in common.
Okay.
All right, so you wrote next to joint tenancy, two or more people, not corporations or entities, because corporations cannot be a joint tenant. Corporations cannot own as a joint tenant. Eventually, as all the co-owners die, ownership's divided among the surviving co-owners, which will eventually leave one owner, last man standing, so to speak, as the tenant in severalty through the process called the right of survivorship. Now, in order to create a joint tenancy, 4 unities have to be in common. You have to have 4 things in common. So to create a joint tenancy, first of all, in New Jersey, language in the deed must expressly state that titles to be taken in that form. You have to say, I don't want to take ownership as a tenant in common. We want to create a joint tenancy. Why would anybody want to create a joint tenancy?
Right of ownership.
The right of survivorship.
Yeah.
Yep. Now, there's 4 unities required to create a joint tenancy, and here's a little acronym to remember that 4 unities, TTIP. It stands for the unities of time, title, interest, and possession. All 4 of these things need to be in common. So what is the right of time, title, interest, and possession? Well, in the book here, they're not printed in order, in that order, time, title, interest, and possession. So, but let's read it in that order. What is the unity of time? It means that all joint tenants must acquire their interest at the same time. Unity of title. Title means ownership. All joint tenants must acquire their interest by the same deed, because that's how we transfer ownership, right? By some sort of deed. Unity of interest. All joint tenants hold equal ownership interest in the property. You can't have somebody who's a 75% owner and one that's 25% as an example. They all have to have equal ownership shares. You got 4 owners, they all have 25% interest. One of them dies and now they all have 33 1/3 interest. Another one dies, now it's 50-50 interest, right? So that's the way that works. When you take ownership in that way, depending on the number of owners, they all have to have equal ownership shares as well. And then lastly, the unity of possession. You cannot physically distinguish which part of the property is mine or yours. I have a percentage of ownership interest in the entire property. There's no line drawn down the middle that says, well, that's my portion. Okay. I have a percentage interest in the entire property. So that's what that explanation here I give for possession again. It means you can't physically distinguish which part of the property is owned by an individual. If you're a 50% owner, you own 50% of the entire property and cannot physically distinguish which part of the property is yours versus a co-owner's. 50% owner of the entire property. So do these highlights, write these notes. Let me know when you got that.
Got it.
Everybody got it?
Got it.
So joint tenancy is known as the poor man's will. Oh, at least I call it the poor man's will. It's a way to inherit property without actually having to have a will written, right? And you don't need to be related to each other, and you're going to get it. And best part is, don't got to go through probate. Oh, no taxes on that need to be paid. So 2 or more owners, usually not married to each other. A corporation can never be a joint tenant. Why not? I keep saying that. Well, now we're going to find out. Because of its perpetual existence. Corporations don't die if the president or CEO dies. They just replace them with someone else. And the corporation's life lives on. It's perpetual in that regard. If a corporation was part of a joint tenancy, it would always be the last man standing, so to speak, right? So that's why a corporation can never be a part of a joint tenancy. Make sense? So to create a joint tenancy, it must be specified in the deed that you wish to take ownership as a joint tenant. All owners have to stipulate that. You need to have 2 or more people not married to each other, create that joint tenancy. The only benefit of having a joint tenancy is the right of survivorship. You can't leave your shares by will to your heirs because the right of survivorship. All owners must have equal ownership shares. All owners hold an undivided interest in the property where you can't physically distinguish which part is mine or yours. I have a percentage interest in the entire property. Each owner can sell their interest without the consent of the others, just like with tenancy in common. However, this is going to damage the joint tenancy because that new owner then does not have the 4 unities in common. I'm going to show you how it damages the joint tenancy in just a second. I'm going to draw some pictures. I'm going to have you see the pictures on screen. So if there's 3 or more owners, the original remaining owner will remain as a joint tenant with the other, and the new owner would be a tenant in common because they don't have those 4 unities in common. So that one new owner can leave their shares by will to their heirs, but the existing owners cannot because they still have the right of survivorship among each other. The new owner does not have the right of survivorship, though. And then owners can partition the property if one wants to sell and the others don't. It is possible to be converted to a tenancy in common or tenancy in severalty as well. Yeah, because as all the owners die down, it becomes a tenancy in severalty when there's only one man standing, so to speak. Or if you sell your interest to someone else and then another partner sells their interest to someone else, they all didn't get it at the same time, that ownership interest. So now they become tenants in common, those new owners. So let's now examine this. These are the rules I put all in one place for you for joint tenancy. The video for explanation is the video that I am showing you right now, that I'm talking to you. So I'm going to create a video out of this. So the joint tenants require 4 unities in common, TTIP, and you have to specify that you wish to take ownership as joint tenants. Otherwise, if you have 3 owners with equal ownership shares, you have owner A, B, and C. They all have equal ownership shares, and that's all I tell you. What form of ownership is this? You have 3 owners, all equal ownership shares, and I don't tell you anything else. What kind of ownership is this?
Joint.
Tenancy in common. It's the default form of ownership when you have 2 or more owners not married to each other. In order to create a joint tenancy, you have to specify you wish to take ownership in that form. Remember? So if I told you that you have 3 or more owners and that's they have equal ownership shares, and I didn't give you any more information other than that, it's a tenancy in common. But now I tell you we have 3 or more owners and they specified they wish to take ownership as joint tenants. Or if I gave you some other information instead of saying that, because that's kind of obvious that it's now joint tenancy. If you have 3 or more owners, all equal ownership shares, they all got their ownership interest at the same time by the same deed. They have an undivided ownership interest in the property, and they cannot leave their shares in a will to their heirs because they have the right of survivorship. Now, what form of ownership is it? Now you can definitely say it's a joint tenancy. So in a joint tenancy, if you have owners A, B, and C, and owner B dies, what happens? A and C splits their shares right down the middle. That's the right of survivorship. So what happens?
Explain the right of survivorship again, please.
Sure.
I'm looking for
You have
the
3
definition. I
owners.
don't see it.
Okay, here, look at this. Owner A, B, and C. They all have equal ownership shares. Owner B dies.
Right. Right.
Owners A and C will split ownership B's interest. So owners A and B will split the ownership shares of interest that owner B had. They don't leave it to heirs. It gets split amongst the surviving owners. That's the right of survivorship. So now you have just owner A and C. each 50-50 owner. And in the event C now dies, A will through the right of survivorship, get their ownership shares because they're the only other owner. So now you got one man standing, so to speak. Owner A is now a tenant in severalty. They're the last man standing, right? Now with a
The
tenant,
right of survivorship doesn't have this long drawn out explanation. It's just if you die, I get, if
right of
you
survivorship,
die,
it's that
it just
simple.
passed along to me.
Yep. It's that simple. So if one co-owner dies, the surviving co-owners automatically equally split the shares of the owner who died. So therefore, you can't leave it in a will because the surviving co-owners will split it. That's the concept about joint tenancy you need to understand, as well as what are the 4 things they need to have in common in order to create it, other than specifying that they wish to create a joint tenancy. TTIP, unity of time, title, interest, and possession. So here's the example where we had 3 owners, one died, their ownership interest was now split equally, automatically, didn't have to go through probate or anything. Owner A and C split owner B's interest equally right down the middle. Now owner C, A and C are left, owner C dies, it only leaves owner A left. And what do you call it when there's only one owner? Tenant in severalty. Your interests are severed from all others. There's no other owners. Now, can they leave their interest in a will to their heirs? Yes, because a tenant in severalty can. There's no more joint tenancy now. Because there only is one last man standing. You need 2 or more owners in order to have a joint tenancy. Okay, let's give another scenario here in a different scenario. I just want to finish up with these joint tenancy and tenancy in entirety, and then we're done for the day. So you have owners A, B, and C here. And owner C is sick and tired of A and B's crap. He's like, you know what? I'm out. I'm selling my interest to my friend D over here, and D's going to become a co-owner with you guys now. Whoa, whoa, whoa. The owner D now, the new owner, does not have the unity of time, title, interest, and possession. They have the unities of interest and possession, but not time and title. He didn't get the ownership at the same time as owners A and B, or by the same deed as A and B. So owner D will be a tenant in common and not a joint tenant. But A and B will still remain as joint tenants with each other because they're the 2 original owners that are left. So if one of them dies, the other will inherit their interest, not D, because D is not a joint tenant. And if D dies, neither of them will inherit D's interest because D was a tenant in common, and tenant in common can leave their shares by a will to their heirs. So now you could have 2 kinds of ownership going on here at one time, right? You got D, who's a new owner. He is a tenant in common. That's why I got the TC written here. He's a tenant in common with each one of them. So now if B dies, A and B were still joint tenants with each other. D was a tenant in common with each of them. A will inherit all of B's interests. So now A will be a 2/3 owner and D will be 1. And there's no more joint tenancy. They're both tenants in common with each other now. And now A or D can leave their shares in a will to their heirs. Okay. And then lastly, we have the tenancy by the entirety. Let's highlight on page 122. A tenancy by the entirety is a special tenancy between, cross out the words husband and wife and write married couples. Several years ago, before Governor Christie left office, he signed gay marriage into law. So now gay people can experience the same misery that the rest of us do. Just kidding. It's a joke. All right, so ownership by married couples is tenancy by the entirety. So the owners must be husband and wife when they receive the property. The owners have the right of survivorship. You know, if your spouse dies, your surviving spouse automatically gets the house. You can't leave it to someone else. And there's no right to partition. If you want to partition your property, you're married to somebody and they don't want to move. If you're at the point that you think that you could take them to court to force them to sell the property, you got other issues you got to deal with first, right? So there's no right of partition because that's what partitioning is, right? Suing your co-owner, forcing them to sell or divide the property. Yeah. So there's no right to partition for married couples. So the tenancy by the entirety is ownership by married couples, at least for the primary marital residence, if married after May 28, 1980, or to all properties if married before, because we got the dower courtesy right thing, right? So owners have the right of survivorship, at least for the primary marital residence. So when your spouse dies, the other gets the house. New Jersey does not now and never did have common law marriage. Common law marriage does not mean if you live with somebody that you're dating for a long enough period of time that you automatically become husband and wife, although a lot of people believe that's what it means. It could mean that if you want that. So states that do have common law marriage, if you're living with each other, you're a couple that's living with each other for a long enough period of time, whatever that time limit was required by your state's law. If you want to be considered married, but you never went through the ceremony or went down to get the marriage license and go through all that, you could be considered legally husband and wife or a married couple if you wanted to be. Remember, there was a comedy on that one for gay marriage. Remember that Meet Chuck and Larry, those two firemen? They're living together to try to get the medical benefits. They faked that they were married. All right. Anyway, that's a little bit different though. When a couple divorces, ownership reverts to a tenancy in common, which is the default form of ownership with two or more people who are not married to each other, and they no longer have the right of survivorship. So there's no right to partition the property while you're married, only after divorce. So if you do get divorced, now you own as tenants in common, and now you have the right to partition the property. And corporations can never be a tenant by the entirety. Why? Because corporations don't get married. People do. When corporations get together, they have mergers, and when they break up, they dissolve that relationship. So the married couples have the right of survivorship. When they get divorced, they no longer have it because now they're tenants in common. Married couples do not have the right to partition a property, but when they get divorced and they become tenants in common, they do. But while they're married, they're considered tenants by the entirety. Okay, so here's the final breakdown to review. Tenancy in severalty is ownership by one person or entity. Tenancy by the entirety is ownership by married couples. Tenancy in common is the default form of ownership with more than one person or entity. And a joint tenancy, you have to specify you wish to take ownership in this way. Corporation can never own as a joint tenant. And you must have 4 unities in common to create that joint tenancy: the unity of time, title, interest, and possession. And the only benefit to having a joint tenancy is the right of survivorship. And remember, now that you know all of these differences, if the question on exam asks you how you would advise someone what form of ownership to take, the answer should be none of the above. because that's legal advice and we don't give legal advice because we're not attorneys. Now, if the question asks, what form of ownership could this be in this situation? Oh, that's different. Now you could answer the question with the knowledge that you've learned. It depends on how they ask it. If they say, how would you advise they take ownership versus what form of ownership could this be or would this be in this scenario? Those are two different things altogether. Okay. One you could answer, the other you can't. Okay. And I think that's it. Yep. And that's it for the forms of ownership. And we'll leave off right there for today. So